Today I'm going to tell you a story about a flower on a hill. The story takes place in a village located in the middle of a valley, hidden by a ring of mountains. Although the people in the village lived simple lives, they worked hard, took care of their families and neighbors, and were happy. One of the surrounding mountains reached so high that what resided at its peak was a mystery to even those who it protected. Parents would tell a story of this great mountain, tales of witches who hid at the top, only coming down to snatch disobedient children, those who weren't tucked in their beds and asleep at night. Though they were all but cut off from the world, those beyond the mountain-covered valley had come to hear different rumors about what was on that hill. Some agreed that there was a witch. Some thought there were goblins that stole any shiny trinket they could get their hands on. And some very logical individuals reasoned that there was, of course, nothing but snow on a snow-capped mountain. However, one rumor spoke of a strange flower that only bloomed at the peak of that hill, with the power to heal any sickness or ailment. The people of the village paid no mind to these rumors, but every once in a while, a desperate spouse or sibling or mother would come trying to climb that great mountain, desperately clinging to one last ray of hope. The people of the village had seen enough determined strangers depart only to never be seen again, to know that all that actually lied on that mountain was death, and a frost too cold for a flower to ever bloom. In the middle of this pragmatic village lived a family of 4, a girl with her 2 parents and a little brother. When they went to work, her mother and father made the girl watch over the boy, who had a tendency to wander off and get himself in trouble. His favorite pastime was climbing, and so every day he would go off looking for taller and taller trees to scale to prove his skill. The girl had grown sick and tired of following around her brother, dressing his wounds when he fell, and constantly checking to make sure he never went too high. The neighbors were also not fans of the boy's daring feats, and so one day he was told by his disgruntled mother that he could only play near the house. This meant the girl could finally ignore her pestering sibling and relax, because as the boy would soon notice, there were no trees to climb near their home. After finally accepting this reality, the boy was about to give up on his aspirations for the day when he saw a lily overhanging the door. Lilies were his mother's favorite flower, and strange enough, there had always been one growing in that exact spot ever since he could remember. Bored and distracted by the flower, the boy decided to climb that house and pick it for his mother, hoping it might convince her to let him go and play beyond the gates once again. Though he could never get a solid footing, her brother was skilled and made his way up the wall of the house. And meanwhile, the girl believed he was still standing outside, looking for a tree he would never find. When he had finally reached the roof, the boy extended his arm to grab the flower, but he had put too much focus on his target. In a second, he had lost his footing and fell. The girl assumed the noise was some rocks being thrown out of boredom, but a chill was sent down her spine later that day when she heard the screams of her mother and saw her father carrying her unconscious brother into the house. To fast forward, several months had passed, and despite constant visits from doctors, healers, and other villagers begging the boy to wake up, her brother simply laid there. The happiness and laughter that had preserved the village through hardship and turmoil almost ceased to flow at its very center, though they tried their best not to blame the girl. She never saw her mother smile after that day, and could only catch glimpses of her father's eyes before he would turn away and go back to his work. Her parents rarely ever left the house anymore. The girl was now responsible for getting food from the market, but cherished these moments away from the sadness and guilt that seemed to engulf her home. During those walks, the girl would spend every second wishing that she had been more attentive and actually watched her brother as her parents had asked. Every second she would blame herself. One day, however, she was sent to buy a few loaves of bread. As always, she spent her time enjoying the faces of the neighbors as she walked down the street. Though the village froze in horror at the time of her brother's incident, After a few months, the same laughter and joy began to flow through the valley as it always had. And though her parents, and especially her mother, couldn't stand to see everyone move on as if nothing had happened, it became the last source of warmth in the girl's life, and she knew it would be extinguished the moment she stepped back into that house. When she arrived at the market, she went straight to the bread stand with the kind old lady who would always let the girl save some money so she could get a treat on her way back. Though every time she wanted bread, she would visit the same old lady, she had never exchanged more than a few polite words. Their interactions always began with a kind, "Hello, sweetheart, and how are you doing today?" and ended with a familiar, "Make sure to get something sweet, and I know things are tough, but tell your parents I say hi, and that I always say an extra prayer for your boy." But today the old lady was silent as she approached, and simply handed her the loaves. The girl thought she must have just been having a bad day or been tired, and simply handed her the money, not thinking too much about it. But as she went to grab the coins, the old lady whispered a few words in the girl's ear. The girl paused for a second, knowing she must have misheard the unusually quiet old lady, but she knew there was no mistake. "Would you really do anything to wake your brother up?" the old lady asked. Without hesitation, the girl, who had never went a moment without thinking of her brother, said yes. And in response, she heard the fateful words that had led so many outsiders to their death. "Then go and find the flower in the hill," she said. The old lady continued to explain that the flower was, in fact, real, and that the reason no one had ever found it was because, like any flower, one needed to make it bloom. The old lady told the girl that if she ever wanted to see her brother wake up again, she would need to go to the peak and stay awake until one of the flowers finally bloomed. The old lady immediately turned away from the girl, as if she had finished delivering her message. She had even forgotten to take the money, the girl thought as she walked away. Rattled and disturbed by the old lady's words, she rushed home, dropped the loaves of bread on the table where her mother was sitting, and hurried to her room. There she spent the next 2 days contemplating the old lady's whispers. Was she really serious? Or was this all some cruel, twisted joke, the girl thought? But is there some chance, even a small chance, that she could be telling the truth? That there might actually be some sort of magical flower at the top of that mountain, and that this flower could wake him up? After those few days of reflection, the girl faced two contradicting realities. The first was that there was no way there was a flower on that tall of a mountain. The second, however, was that the old lady wasn't speculating or guessing, that there was a flower waiting on that hill. Eventually, when the girl left her room, she realized that there was nothing left in her home. Her parents hadn't even checked on her once, and her mother still sat there at the table with the loaves she had left, just lying there. And so she came to her final conclusion, that if there was a flower on the top of that hill, she had to be the one to find it. And so after some light packing, she went. Luckily for the girl, enough travelers had gone up the mountain alone with no success that they only traveled in groups, formed with a solemn promise to share the flower with each of its members if possible. Though she was not an ideal addition, after searching for a while, one group was so moved by her motives that they promised to get her up that mountain. Regardless of how many went up that great mountain, it was never guaranteed that one would be able to make it to the top, or even be able to make it back down. Only a handful had ever completed the round trip, and though there was only one entrance, it was well known that the story of each of these surviving members didn't match in a single detail, as if they had each ascended a different mountain completely. That was all except for one glaring reality, that they were each the only surviving member of their group. Though these 5 outsiders had only just met this girl, and had traveled far longer than her in search for this healing power, they had kept their promise. They had each protected, sheltered, and eventually sacrificed until the girl was eventually standing at the edge of a flat piece of land, with no more mountain to ascend, or even clouds to look up to. It had taken almost a month, but there she stood, alone, with no flower in sight, just as the stories had said. The girl had spent half a day in search of the sprout that the old lady had promised, but to her growing horror as the day went on, it seemed as if all she could find on that snow-capped mountain was snow. She held back tears as well as the thought that she had locked deep in her mind, which grew louder and louder since she had began climbing the mountain, and every time that she had lost a group member. When she closed her eyes, she would hear them say that if she could just make it to the mountain, if she could just promise that she would help his wife, their brother, her child, if she could just make it to the peak and make the flower bloom. And every time they asked, she agreed. But when the sun had finally set on her search, she fell to the ground in tears. There was no flower, no sprout. She went to lay down in the snow with the cold air piercing through her gloves, when she finally had to let her worst fear roam free. That maybe the villagers were right. That maybe all that lied on this mountain was death and a frost too cold for a flower to ever bloom. However, when her back hit the snow, she felt a prick. When she turned around, to her delight and subsequent horror, there laid a sprout frozen in ice. As a drop of her blood ran down the side of the sprout, she got up and began to cry even harder. She didn't want to get her hopes up, but she couldn't help but consider the possibility that the old lady was right, that this hadn't been some kind of prank, that she may have been even telling the truth. Regardless, the girl knew what she had to do, or more what she could never do. She couldn't fall asleep. On the way up the mountain, those 5 strangers asked very little of her. They shared their food, they made the fire, they even carried her to the next stopping point when she could no longer walk. There was only one thing they ever demanded from her: that she never fall asleep before telling one of them. After hearing some of the stories in the village, and because she was just a child, they told her that if she ever slept too long without warning them, one of the goblins that lived at the peak would come down and swipe away her soul when no one was looking, and that she would never wake up. The girl entertained their kind warnings, but she knew her enemy was not as cunning but much more dangerous. She felt the cold air trying to convince her body that it was time to rest, and the piercing winds singing a sweet lullaby. But she refused. She had traveled all the way up the mountain. She had even left her family without so much as a goodbye, and all her companions' hope lied in her making the flower bloom. And so she sat there, tired and hungry, but awake nonetheless. She passed the first few days staring at the clouds, saying whatever objects or animals she could find out loud, and at night she glanced at the stars, tracing constellations and making her own. She would also occasionally sing, sometimes singing the jigs she used to hear walking through the village, and once in a while, the songs that her mother would sing to put her and her brother to sleep. But those songs never put her to sleep. She would only pretend so that she could stay up and listen to her mother's voice. When the 3rd night came, the girl became too tired to sit up and finally decided that she would lay down to give her back a rest. It's okay, she thought, as long as I don't fall asleep. And to her credit, she didn't. For 5 nights she lay there waiting for that flower. But despite the clouds and the stars and the songs she sang, she could feel her eyes close a little more every night, and the thought of the old lady's words, the village, and even her brother became more and more blurred. By the 6th day, she'd almost forgotten why she was even on the mountain in the first place. All that laid in front of her was the same frozen sprout covered in a drop of blood, the same as it had been the day before and the day before that. On that final night, nothing laid in front of her. Her eyes had closed against her will, and no matter how much she wanted to, she could no longer stay awake. It had been about a month since her parents' frantic search was held frozen by news of where the girl had gone. A week after she had left, the old lady came to her distraught parents, troubled by a recurring dream she had that involved the girl. What was even more troubling was what she had said in the dream, and what she had promised. After hearing the old lady's words, her parents were only left to wonder why the girl would chase such a far-fetched dream, feeling their sense of guilt climax, even when it had taken them a whole week to even notice she was gone. But while they stood there, finally beginning to understand the consequences of their neglect, the girl laid there alone on that mountain, with only the promise of a flower as she finally gave in to the hill. A great scream roared through the village that night. All the villagers recognized the voice, and though they had hoped that maybe the girl could do the impossible, they all knew the mother would eventually have to face the reality that she had lost both of her children. To everyone's surprise, however, in between the loud cries, they heard the sound of laughter. The boy had woken up. The next morning, it seemed as if the whole village had come to see the miracle. Not only had the boy woken up, but he was able to walk and even skip through the town. Great music and celebration ran through the village, as well as a singular thought. How was this possible? Had the girl actually done it? In the morning, the mother had told the boy that his sister was away picking up medicine. She wanted him to enjoy his first day back amongst the living, and she prayed that it might just be true. But after a long, joyous day, as they were walking back into the house, the boy once again looked up and saw the flower overhanging their door. "When is Lily coming back?" he asked.